The Nevada desert stretched endlessly beneath the belly of the F-22 Raptor, a vast canvas of rust-colored earth and skeletal rock formations that seemed to mock the very idea of human presence. Commander Sarah Mitchell gripped the control stick with practiced ease, her jaw set in the concentrated expression of a pilot who'd flown this jet through worse conditions than a clear desert afternoon. The heads-up display glowed amber and green before her eyes, feeding her a constant stream of data: altitude, speed, fuel consumption, approach vectors, all the information she needed to keep her $150 million aircraft in the air. But her mind was elsewhere. The reassignment orders had arrived 3 weeks ago, and they'd carried with them a sense of inevitability that no amount of coffee or physical exercise could shake. Naval Air Station Fallon, Nevada, temporary duty assignment, air support coordination for SEAL Team 6 operations. It should have been routine, career building, even. A chance to work with the Navy's most elite operators, to add another line to her personnel file that would look good when promotion boards convened. But the coded language in the memo had been unmistakable, picked up by years of reading between military lines. Coordination meant she wouldn't be flying live combat. She'd be sitting in a command center, monitoring screens, relaying information. Essentially, she'd be trading her pilot's seat for a desk, at least temporarily. And while the orders came from the Pentagon, signed by people who didn't know her name, she had no doubt that the real message originated from somewhere else, someone who didn't want her there. The radio crackled to life. "Raptor 1, you are cleared for descent to Angels 23. Welcome to Fallen Approach," came a bored voice from air traffic control. "Fallen Approach, Raptor 1 descending to Angels 23, Mitchell responded, her tone brisk and professional. She pushed the control stick forward gently, and the jet's nose dipped, the engine's whine shifting in pitch as she began her descent. The landscape below grew larger, more defined. She could make out the outlines of the base now. The runway stretched across the desert like a gray ribbon, hangars clustered together like square brown boxes, barracks and administrative buildings arranged in geometric precision. It looked exactly like every other military installation she'd ever seen, organized, sterile, indifferent to the drama of human ambition and politics that played out within its boundaries. Mitchell had been through this dance before. She was 38 years old, had logged over 2,000 hours in combat aircraft, and had a combat service record that spoke for itself. She'd been the first in her class at the Naval Academy to get her pilot wings. She'd flown over the mountains of Afghanistan, over the deserts of Iraq, over regions where the ground below tried to kill you every single day. She'd lost friends, good people, the best people, and she'd carried that weight with her on every subsequent mission. And she'd earned a call sign that made other pilots' eyes go wide when they heard it whispered in the ready room. But call signs and records only got you so far. Politics, tradition, and the stubborn resistance of institutions larger than any individual always found a way to assert itself. The Raptor touched down with barely a whisper of friction, the landing gear absorbing the impact with mechanical precision. Mitchell taxied toward the designated parking area, cut the engines, and sat in the sudden silence, watching the heat shimmer off the runway ahead of her. A ground crew approached in a small truck, ready to guide her the rest of the way. 20 minutes later, she was showered and in uniform, her duffel bag sitting on the back seat of the rental car as she pulled up to the commander's headquarters building. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the parking lot, and the building itself, a mid-century concrete structure with none of the charm or character of older installations, stood as a monument to military efficiency stripped of any human warmth. The adjutant's office was on the second floor. A young captain with sharp eyes and a neutral expression escorted her down the corridor. "Admiral Hancock is expecting you, Commander," the captain said, knocking on the heavy wooden door before departing. "Come in." The office was exactly as she'd expected. Leather-bound military histories on the shelves, a large mahogany desk positioned to catch the afternoon light streaming through the window, and behind it, Admiral Raymond Hancock. He was in his 60s, with steel-gray hair and the bearing of a man who'd spent decades being obeyed without question. His face was lined, weathered by years of sun and stress, and his eyes held the cold clarity of someone who'd made difficult decisions and slept well afterward. Hancock didn't stand when she entered. He remained seated, his hands folded on the desk, watching her approach with the expression of a man examining a piece of equipment that had arrived at his facility by mistake. Mitchell came to attention and saluted sharply. "Commander Sarah Mitchell, reporting as ordered, sir." Hancock's eyes flicked from her face to her uniform, taking in every detail. When his gaze returned to her eyes, there was something dismissive in it, a flicker of assessment that concluded she'd been judged and found wanting before she'd said another word. "Commander Mitchell," he said finally, his voice the deep rumble of authority accumulated over decades. He gestured to the chair across from his desk. "Sit." She sat, her back straight, her hands in her lap, the picture of military composure. But her heart was pounding, and the blood in her ears seemed very loud. "Your orders are for temporary duty assignment as Air Support Coordinator for the upcoming Joint SEAL Team 6 training operation," Hancock said, reading from a folder on his desk as if Mitchell hadn't already read those exact words 100 times. "This will last approximately 3 months, after which you'll return to your previous duty station." "Yes, sir," Mitchell said. "I assume you have combat flying experience." There was something in the way he phrased it, not asking, but acknowledging it with a tone that suggested combat flying experience meant nothing where he was concerned, where practical operations were concerned. "Yes, sir, over 2,000 hours in operational theaters." Hancock nodded slowly as if this confirmed something he'd suspected. He leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking beneath his weight. "That's all well and good, Commander, but here at Fallen we do things a certain way, tried and true methods. We value pilots who understand tradition, who respect the chain of command, who don't bring unnecessary complications into our operations." The emphasis on complications hung in the air between them like a physical thing. "I understand, sir," Mitchell said, and she did understand. She understood perfectly. "Good, your quarters have been arranged. You'll report to the Coordination Center at 600 hours tomorrow. That will be all, Commander." As Mitchell stood and saluted, she caught the briefest glimpse of something in Hancock's expression. Not respect, not welcome, but a kind of resigned acceptance of an inconvenience he'd been forced to tolerate. He was already returning his attention to his paperwork before she turned to leave. She closed the door quietly behind her and stood in the corridor for a moment, breathing slowly, feeling the weight of what lay ahead pressing down on her shoulders like a physical force. The game had begun. The officers' quarters assigned to Commander Mitchell was a small, austere room with military precision and zero personality. A single bed with a blue comforter pulled tight enough to bounce a coin off, a desk, a chair, and a window overlooking the flight line where F-16s were being prepped for evening sorties. She'd unpacked her single duffel bag methodically, hanging her spare uniforms in the narrow closet, arranging her toiletries in the bathroom with the efficiency of someone who'd done this 100 times before in 100 different bases. The room smelled like disinfectant and the ghost of 1,000 anonymous officers who'd passed through before her. That first night, she lay in bed listening to the distant rumble of aircraft engines and the wind rattling the window panes. Sleep didn't come easily. Her mind kept replaying the meeting with Hancock, parsing every word, every gesture, looking for something she might have missed or misinterpreted. But no, the message had been clear. She was here as an obligation, a box that needed to be checked, a complication that had been imposed from above and would be tolerated only as long as necessary. The next morning, Mitchell woke at 4:30 and went through her routine with mechanical precision. Physical training in the base gym, empty at that hour, which she was grateful for. Shower. Fresh uniform, pressed and immaculate. Coffee from the officers' mess, strong and bitter. And by 600 hours, she was walking across the tarmac toward the Coordination Center, a nondescript building near the hangars where screens glowed with real-time intelligence feeds and flight data. The staff inside, 3 captains and 4 enlisted personnel, all male, all with the look of people who'd been doing this job for years, barely glanced up when she entered. The senior captain, a man named Peterson with a weathered face and tired eyes, gave her the barest nod of acknowledgement before returning his attention to the screens. "You'll be in the analyst station," Peterson said, pointing to a desk in the corner. "That's where you coordinate air support requests. Pretty straightforward. You'll take requests from ground units, cross-reference them with our available assets, and relay appropriate vectors to the pilots. Questions?" "No, sir," Mitchell said. "Good, there's coffee in the back. Don't break anything." That was her welcome to the Coordination Center. By day 2, Mitchell had established a routine. She arrived early, stayed late, and asked questions only when absolutely necessary. She learned the systems, familiarized herself with the base's air assets, and studied the operational procedures that had been established long before she arrived. Her efficiency was impeccable, not because she was trying to impress anyone, but because that was who she was. Attention to detail, excellence in execution. These weren't things she performed. They were woven into the fabric of who she was as an officer and a pilot. But efficiency, she was learning, didn't translate to acceptance. On Wednesday morning, she walked into the officers' mess for breakfast and watched conversations die mid-sentence. The pilots, a cluster of them at a corner table, men in their 40s and 50s whose call signs were embroidered on their flight jackets, looked at her the way someone might look at an uninvited guest who'd wandered into a private gathering. She got her coffee and eggs, took a seat at an empty table, and pretended not to notice the resumed conversation that carefully excluded any topic that might interest her. She caught fragments, new training protocol, heard about the ops tempo increasing, admin changes coming down from the Pentagon, nothing direct, nothing meant for her ears. The whispers started small. By Friday, they become a constant hum beneath the surface of daily interactions. She heard them in the hallway outside the Coordination Center, caught them in the slight tilt of heads, the quick glances that turned away when she approached. She heard them in the ready room while she was reviewing flight schedules in the cafeteria, even walking across the parking lot, fragments of conversation that coalesced into a singular message. She didn't belong here. "Did you hear she got stuck behind a desk?" That came from a captain she'd never met, speaking to another pilot near the flight line. "Probably couldn't cut it in combat operations." Another voice replied, too low for her to hear clearly but the tone unmistakable. "Think Hancock will find a way to ship her out early." "Let's hope." Friday afternoon, Mitchell was in the Coordination Center when Peterson called her over to his desk. "We've got some procedural updates coming down from command," he said, not making eye contact. "They're going to change how we handle real-time coordination requests. Apparently, someone thought our current system was outdated." The subtext was clear. Someone from above had imposed these changes, and Peterson resented having to implement them. And somehow, her presence had become associated with that change, even though she'd had nothing to do with it. "I understand, sir," Mitchell said. "Do you?" Peterson looked at her for the first time, and there was something sharp in his eyes. "Because I'm not sure you do understand how things work here. We don't need revolutionaries or reformers. We need people who know their place and do their job. You understand your place." It took everything Mitchell had not to respond. She was a commander in the United States Navy. She'd earned her rank through years of service and sacrifice. She understood her place better than Peterson understood his own limitations. But saying that would only confirm whatever biases had already formed about her. "Yes, sir," she said quietly. That evening, alone in her quarters, Mitchell allowed herself a moment of genuine doubt. She stood at the window looking out at the darkened flight line and wondered if she'd made a mistake accepting this assignment. She wondered if 3 months of this, the cold shoulders, the subtle insubordination, the psychological warfare of exclusion, would damage her career more than it advanced it. Her phone buzzed, a text from her sister. "How's the new assignment? Better than combat zones?" Mitchell stared at the message for a long moment before typing back, "Working through some logistics. I'll call you Sunday." She didn't mention the tension, the dismissal, the feeling of being caught between worlds, too accomplished to dismiss, too female to accept. Her sister was a lawyer in San Francisco, worlds away from the military's Byzantine politics. There was no point explaining it. Some battles, Mitchell knew, couldn't be articulated to people who didn't live them. Saturday morning came gray and cold. Mitchell ran 6 miles in the desert, pushing herself harder than usual, letting the physical exertion burn away some of the frustration that had been accumulating through the week. The landscape was beautiful in a harsh way, unforgiving, indifferent, honest in a manner that human institutions would never be. By the time she returned to base, she'd made a decision. She would do her job. She would do it well. She would wait, watch, and see what the universe had in store. And if the SEAL teams arrived with the same prejudices, the same dismissals, the same subtle warfare, well, she dealt with worse. Though in her heart, she wasn't sure that was entirely true. Sunday afternoon, as she prepared her uniform for the week ahead, she received an email notification. SEAL Team 6 arrival confirmed. Operation briefing scheduled for 800 hours Monday. The game was about to begin in earnest. The briefing room was austere, concrete walls painted institutional beige, a long table with a projector mounted on the ceiling, and maps pinned to the walls showing the training zone in meticulous detail. Mitchell arrived 40 minutes early, her briefing materials organized in a leather folder, her notes color-coded by operational phase. She'd spent the previous evening preparing, reviewing every contingency, every possible variable that might come up during the operation. Excellence was not something she performed, it was something she demanded of herself. The door at the far end of the briefing room burst open, and they came through like a force of nature, 5 men in desert fatigues, their bearing unmistakable even before Mitchell registered the SEAL team insignias on their shoulders. They moved with a coordinated efficiency, each man aware of every other, their eyes constantly scanning, assessing, taking in details that most people would miss entirely. The man in front was tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of scarred hands that spoke of years of field work. His face was weathered beyond his apparent years, his eyes the pale gray of someone who'd seen things that left permanent marks. This had to be Master Chief Derek Patterson, Ghost, as he was called in certain circles, though Mitchell had only heard the name whispered once or twice before. Patterson's eyes swept across the briefing room, landed on Mitchell for approximately 1 second, and then moved on without registering anything beyond her status as a piece of furniture. He pulled out a chair at the head of the table and sat, his team arranging themselves around him like pieces on a chessboard, each positioned with clear lines of sight to the doors and windows. They moved like men, accustomed to being in dangerous spaces. "Gentlemen," Mitchell said, standing and extending her hand toward Patterson, "I'm Commander Sarah Mitchell. I'll be coordinating air support for your operation. I've prepared." Patterson didn't stand, didn't smile, didn't even acknowledge her extended hand. He simply gestured to a young SEAL beside him, probably mid-20s, lean and sharp-eyed. "That's Petty Officer Matthews. He handles our air coordination. Anything you need to say, you can say to him." The dismissal was complete and absolute. Mitchell lowered her hand slowly, every muscle in her face locked down tight. She could feel the eyes of the other SEALs on her, watching her reaction with the intensity of men who'd learned to read people as a survival skill. She turned away from Patterson and addressed Matthews instead, laying out the tactical air support coordinates with the precision she'd developed over thousands of hours. "These are your primary approach vectors," she explained, pointing to the map with a laser pointer. "If you encounter resistance here, you have 3 alternate routes, all of which offer comparable cover. Air support will be on station at 800 hours, and I'll maintain continuous radio contact with your ground team leader. Any requests for immediate air assistance can be relayed through." "We've run this operation 3 times already, Commander." Patterson's voice cut through her explanation like a blade. He didn't look up from the notebook he was pretending to read. "We don't need air support. We don't need coordination. And frankly, we don't need someone reading coordinates off a flowchart to walk us through a training exercise we could conduct with our eyes closed." The silence that followed was the kind that had weight to it. One of the older SEALs, a man with a thick beard and a scar running down the left side of his neck, shifted uncomfortably. The younger guys remained impassive, trained professionals who knew better than to show reaction to whatever power play was happening at the table. Mitchell took a breath. She could feel her heart rate accelerating, adrenaline flooding her system, her brain already cycling through possible responses. She could challenge Patterson directly, point out that if they didn't need air support, then why were they being assigned air support? She could appeal to protocol, cite the operational directives that mandated coordination between air and ground assets. She could do a lot of things. Instead, she closed her folder carefully, set the laser pointer on the table, and sat down. "You're right, Master Chief," she said quietly. "You've run this operation before. You know your personnel, your capabilities, your limitations. I respect that." She paused, letting her words settle into the room. "When you decide you need air support, I'll be in the coordination center, ready to provide it. If you want to go through this without me, that's entirely your call." Patterson finally looked at her. There was something like surprise in his pale eyes, as if he'd expected her to fight back and was momentarily disconcerted by her refusal to do so. His jaw tightened slightly. "Let's keep it that way," he said flatly, returning his attention to his notebook. The briefing continued, but Mitchell was excluded entirely from it. Patterson and his team discussed their operational parameters, their insertion point, their primary and secondary objectives, and their extraction timeline, all without acknowledging her presence. She sat in her chair and took notes, watching the dynamic between Patterson and his men, seeing the trust and cohesion that came from years of operating together. These weren't just soldiers. These were warriors who'd bled together, who'd lost friends together, who understood each other at a level that most civilians would never comprehend. And Patterson was testing her, the way a predator might test the fence of its cage, not quite believing it could be that simple to dismiss her, waiting for her to break protocol and prove she was as incompetent as her presence on his base suggested. When the briefing concluded, Patterson stood without a word and headed for the door, his team following. At the threshold, he paused and looked back at Mitchell. "Operation commences at 400 hours tomorrow," he said. "Try not to get in the way." Then he was gone, leaving a kind of vacuum in his wake. Mitchell sat alone at the briefing table, her materials still laid out before her, her notes precise and complete despite being completely ignored. She could feel the tremor in her hands, not from fear, but from the intense concentration of not allowing her anger or frustration to show. She'd handled worse than this. She'd flown through sandstorms. She'd ejected from a burning jet and waited 3 hours in enemy territory for extraction. She'd buried friends and continued flying the next day because that's what you did in this profession. But this felt different somehow. This felt personal in a way that combat never quite managed to be. Mitchell gathered her materials, turned off the projector, and walked out of the briefing room. The corridor was empty, but she could hear voices from the enlisted men's quarters down the hall, the SEAL team already settling in, probably reviewing their operational parameters again, preparing for tomorrow's exercise. She walked back to the coordination center, logged into the secure system, and pulled up the training zone maps. Patterson wanted to conduct this operation without her. Fine, she'd let him, but she'd be watching every moment, tracking every movement, ready for whatever went wrong. Because something always went wrong. That was the only certainty in operations like this. As she stared at the map, her reflection ghosted in the dark monitor, pale, determined, and absolutely certain that tomorrow, one way or another, would change everything. The operation began at 400 hours with the kind of stillness that precedes chaos. Mitchell was in the coordination center, her hands poised over the keyboard, tracking the SEAL team's movement through the training zone via thermal imaging and GPS coordinates. The desert was clear, visibility unlimited, the sky a deep purple fading toward black on the eastern horizon. Everything was proceeding exactly as planned. Patterson's team had inserted smoothly into the canyon system, designated as their objective. Mitchell could see their heat signatures moving with coordinated precision, each man a distinct thermal blob on her monitor, their spacing indicating they were operating in full tactical awareness. The weather station had predicted clear conditions throughout the day. The weather station was wrong. At 8:47 hours, the alert came through. Severe weather system moving rapidly across the region. Wind speeds increasing. Dust storm developing in the valley system, where Patterson's team was conducting their training exercise. What had been a cloudless sky was suddenly roiling with brown dust that obscured everything. Visibility dropped from unlimited to approximately 50 meters in the space of 4 minutes. All units be advised, severe dust storm inbound, Peterson called out from his station, his voice taking on the clipped tones of a professional confronting a crisis. Visibility degrading rapidly. All aircraft maintain altitude and vector to alternate landing zones. Copy that, came the response from various pilots in the air. One F-16 was working a different training exercise 15 miles south. It immediately turned toward clear skies. But Patterson and his team were on the ground, and they were in the canyon system, deep terrain with limited egress routes. Ghost team, this is fallen coordination, Peterson called out. Be advised, severe weather system affecting your AO. What's your status? There was a pause. For several seconds, nothing but static. Then Patterson's voice came through, and even through the radio compression, Mitchell could hear the first hint of concern. Fallen coordination, we're in the canyon. Visibility just dropped to near zero. We're going to hole up and wait for the storm to pass. We've got shelter in the primary canyon system. Should be fine. Copy that, Ghost team, standing by. Mitchell's eyes locked on the thermal imaging display. Patterson's team was indeed sheltered, but their primary extraction route, the canyon mouth that connected to the open desert, was now a wind tunnel of blowing sand. The alternate extraction route was longer, more complex, and would require traversing terrain that was now completely obscured by the dust storm. Peterson leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. Well, we wait. Storm like this usually passes in 30 to 40 minutes. They'll be fine. But Mitchell was looking at the weather radar. The system wasn't moving. It was actually intensifying. The color coding on the display shifted from yellow to orange to red. This wasn't a passing squall. This was a serious atmospheric event, the kind that could strand people for hours or days. She pulled up the meteorological data, studying the wind vectors, the pressure systems, the moisture content. Her mind was already 3 steps ahead, running calculations, identifying problems, trying to solve an equation that had no good solutions. Fallen coordination, ghost team, Patterson's voice crackled through again, and now there was definitely an edge to it. The storm is getting worse. The alternate exit route is becoming untenable. We're going to need extraction. Peterson sat forward. Ghost team, all aircraft in the area are grounded due to visibility. We can't launch any birds in these conditions. You're going to have to sit tight and... Negative, Patterson cut him off. We need extraction now. This storm isn't letting up. We've got a 30-minute window before the entire valley becomes impassable. We need air support. Mitchell was already moving. She stood up from her chair, her hands clenched into fists. Every protocol, every regulation, every bit of institutional safety procedure screamed against what she was about to do. Flying in those conditions was impossible. The wind shear alone could tear the wings off her jet. The sand would shred her canopy. The visibility meant she'd essentially be flying blind through a canyon system. It was suicide. She was also the only pilot within 100 miles who had any chance of pulling it off. "Sir," Mitchell said, addressing Peterson directly, "launch authorization for immediate air support. I can make that pick up." Peterson's head snapped toward her. "Negative, Commander. Visibility is near zero. No aircraft can safely." "I can," Mitchell said flatly. She was already moving toward the door. "My jet has forward-looking infrared, terrain-following radar and advanced avionics that can navigate in these conditions. I can see through that storm. Those men can't wait 30 minutes. They'll be trapped." "Commander, that's an order to stand down," Peterson called after her, but she was already out the door, her boots echoing on the concrete floor as she ran toward the flight line. The ground crew had her F-22 prepped within 5 minutes. She'd made sure of that every morning, every single day, just in case. Mitchell climbed into the canopy, her fingers flying through the startup sequence with the automaticity of 10,000 hours of muscle memory. The engines whined to life, and she pushed the throttle forward, feeling the thrust build beneath her as systems came online. "Fallen Tower, Raptor 1, requesting immediate takeoff clearance," she said into her radio. There was a pause, then, "Raptor 1 cleared for immediate takeoff, all other traffic clear of runway." The F-22 accelerated down the runway, and Mitchell felt that familiar sensation of gravity releasing its grip as the jet lifted away from the earth. She pushed the nose up through the brown haze of the dust storm, climbing into air that was slightly clearer, though still heavily obscured. Her instruments painted the world for her, radar showing the terrain below, the canyon walls, the exact position of the SEAL team trapped in the valley below. "Ghost Team, this is Viper," she said into the radio, her call sign slipping out almost without conscious thought. "I've got you on thermal. I'm coming in." There was a moment of silence, then Patterson's voice, different now, shocked. "Who the hell is Viper?" But Mitchell was already turning her jet toward the canyon system, pushing the throttle to military power, feeling the G-forces begin to build as she maneuvered through the invisible landscape. Her jet was flying through conditions that should have been impossible. The instruments were her eyes now. The radar was her vision, and her hands were steady on the controls as she threaded the needle between rock walls that were little more than data points on her display. The wind shear hit her like a physical blow, and she compensated automatically. 10 years of experience crystallized into instinctive responses. The sand streamed across her canopy, a solid brown wall that blotted out any chance of visual reference. She was completely dependent on her instruments now, flying on faith and training. "Ghost Team, I've got you visual on thermal," she transmitted. "I'm going to vector you east toward the secondary canyon exit. Follow my guidance exactly." "Copy, Viper," Patterson's voice came back. "We're moving." Mitchell guided them through the storm with a voice like ice water, calm and absolutely certain, even as her jet bucked through turbulence that threatened to tear it apart. She talked them through every turn, every obstacle, positioning herself as an aerial guide through a landscape that had become completely hostile. They cleared the canyon system, with less than 2 minutes to spare before the east exit became completely obscured by the advancing dust wall. As the SEAL team reached safe ground, Mitchell peeled her jet upward and out of the storm, breaking through the brown chaos into clear blue sky. Her hands were shaking as she leveled off at 10,000 feet, her heart hammering against her ribs like it was trying to escape. She'd just done something impossible, and everyone on the ground below had seen her do it. Everything was about to change. Patterson and his team stumbled out of the canyon system into clearing skis, their gear caked with sand, their breathing heavy from exertion and adrenaline. They'd been moving at full tactical speed for the last 5 minutes, guided by a voice that had cut through the chaos of the storm with surgical precision. Patterson's mind was still processing what had just happened. The impossible had become real, and a woman he'd dismissed and insulted had just saved his entire team. The F-22 had already disappeared into the clouds overhead, vectoring back toward the base. "Ghost, you good?" One of the younger SEALs, Martinez, just 26 years old, sharp as a blade, asked breathlessly, falling into formation beside Patterson. "Yeah," Patterson said, but he wasn't thinking about his team's physical condition. He was thinking about what had just happened in that storm, the precision, the confidence, the absolute certainty in that voice on the radio. This wasn't a routine piece of flying. This was something extraordinary. This was the kind of flying that came from experience at the highest levels of combat aviation. Back at the coordination center, the place had erupted into controlled chaos. Peterson was on the phone with Admiral Hancock, reporting the successful extraction. Mitchell had landed safely, her jet showing no damage despite what should have been catastrophic conditions. The entire base was vibrating with the shock of what they'd just witnessed. Mitchell herself was climbing down from her jet, her flight suit damp with sweat, her hands still trembling slightly from the adrenaline crash. The ground crew was already swarming the aircraft, running preliminary checks, taking in the fact that the jet had endured conditions that should have shredded it. She'd barely made it back to the coordination center when Patterson appeared at the door, still in his tactical gear, still covered in sand. His pale gray eyes focused on her with an intensity that made even hardened officers take a step back. "That was you," Patterson said, "not a question, a statement of fact." Mitchell turned slowly from the thermal imaging display. "I was providing air support, Master Chief. That's my job." "No," Patterson said, stepping closer. "That's not what I'm asking." His voice had changed. The contempt was gone, replaced by something else. Something that sounded almost like awe. "Who were you in the cockpit? Because nobody flies like that except—" He stopped mid-sentence. The room had gone very quiet. Peterson had stopped talking. The other coordinators were pretending to work while actually being completely focused on this conversation. Mitchell met Patterson's eyes directly. "I did what needed to be done, Master Chief." "That's not an answer," Patterson said. Then more quietly, "The call sign, you used it on the radio. Viper, you're Viper." Mitchell didn't confirm or deny. She simply turned back to her displays, her jaw set. But that was confirmation enough. Patterson walked backward slowly, his hand coming up to his mouth, his expression shifting through several emotions in rapid succession. Shock, recognition, understanding, then something that looked like anger, not at Mitchell but at himself. "Holy shit," he whispered. By that evening, the word had spread through the base like wildfire. Viper. The pilot who disappeared into the mountains of Afghanistan 3 years ago and come out with a legend attached to her name. The one who'd pulled Delta Team out of an ambush in the Hindu Kush with a maneuver that shouldn't have been possible. The one whose tactical skills were so precise, so deadly, so perfectly executed that the special operations community had built myths around her name. Viper had been a ghost story the SEALs told each other. A woman who existed in classified reports and radio intercepts, whose call sign was whispered with reverence in quiet moments, whose name meant that help was coming even when everything seemed lost. And she'd been sitting in a coordination center the entire time, dismissed and insulted by the very people who'd heard the stories. Patterson found himself in the officers' club that evening, surrounded by his team. They were all talking about it. The impossible flying, the certainty in her voice, the way she'd calculated vectors and wind shear and terrain in real time, all while her jet was being torn apart by atmospheric conditions that should have been impossible to fly in. "I was a dick to her," Martinez said, not making it a question. "We all were," the man with the scarred neck, Chief Torres, who'd been operating with Patterson for 8 years, said quietly. He was staring into his beer like it held answers. "We heard the stories, the Viper, the legend, and she was sitting right there and we didn't know. We thought she was just some admin officer, some desk jockey." "She never said anything," another SEAL observed. "After I cut her off in the briefing, she just sat there, professional, composed, like she was used to people not believing in her." Patterson was silent, processing the weight of what he'd done. He'd tested her, challenged her, dismissed her, and she'd passed every test with the kind of flying that made other pilots question whether they belonged in the same profession. The truth was, she existed at a level above most people. She was rare, exceptional, one of the best in the world at what she did. And he'd treated her like she was in the way. "We need to apologize," Torres said finally, looking at Patterson with the directness of a man who'd bled alongside his commanding officer more times than he could count. "Sir." Patterson nodded slowly. "Yeah, we do." The next morning, the base began to shift in subtle ways. The pilots who'd been distant became respectful. The support staff who'd whispered about her in hallways suddenly became professional and engaged. Admiral Hancock asked for a meeting with Patterson, which Patterson used to explain what had happened, what he'd witnessed, and who the woman in the coordination center actually was. Hancock's face had gone pale. By that afternoon, something interesting happened. The SEALs began congregating in areas where Mitchell would pass: the cafeteria, the hallway outside the coordination center, the flight line. They weren't approaching her directly. That would be inappropriate, and they understood protocols. But they made their presence known. They made it clear, through their positioning and their attention, that they had acknowledged her. One of the older SEALs, a man named Richardson who'd been in the teams for 23 years, approached her as she was walking back to the coordination center after lunch. "Commander," he said, saluting formally, "I wanted you to know that what you did yesterday was the most incredible piece of flying I've ever witnessed. I've been in this community my entire adult life, and I've never seen anything like it." Mitchell accepted the salute with a slight nod. "Thank you, Chief. I was just doing my job." "Ma'am," Richardson said, his eyes steady on hers. "With all due respect, that wasn't a job. That was something else. That was artistry." As he walked away, Mitchell felt something shift inside her. The weight she'd been carrying for the past week, the dismissal, the coldness, the sense of not belonging, it hadn't disappeared entirely, but it had been joined by something else: recognition, respect, the knowledge that what she'd done in that storm had meant something profound to the people she'd saved. That evening, she returned to her quarters and found an envelope slipped under her door. Inside were printed orders, formal acknowledgement from Admiral Hancock that her temporary duty assignment was being extended for an additional 6 months, with a notation that she was exceptional and invaluable to operations. But attached to it was a second note, written in Hancock's own hand. "Commander, I owe you a very significant apology. We will speak tomorrow. Admiral Hancock." Mitchell sat on her bed, holding the papers, understanding that the game she'd been playing since her arrival had fundamentally changed. She was no longer trying to prove herself. She'd already proven everything that mattered. Now she just had to figure out what came next. The summons came at 1400 hours. "Admiral Hancock requests your presence in his office at 1500 hours. Full dress uniform." Mitchell read the message twice, her mind cycling through possibilities. Commendation, disciplinary action for flying outside protocol, some kind of operational briefing. She dressed in her dress whites, crisp, formal, the uniform reserved for official occasions, and made her way across the base to the Admiral's headquarters. The adjutant nodded to her without comment and waved her directly through to Hancock's office. No waiting, no ceremonies, just access. She found Hancock standing at the window, his back to her, his hands clasped behind him. He was still in service dress, not dress whites, which suggested this wasn't an official ceremony of any kind. When he heard her approach, he turned, and Mitchell was struck by how much older he looked than he had a week ago. "Commander," he said quietly, "please sit." Mitchell sat in the chair across from his desk, her posture perfect, her expression neutral. She'd learned long ago not to show emotion in situations where the outcome was uncertain. Hancock took his seat slowly, like a man who'd been carrying a heavy weight for a long time and was finally setting it down. For a long moment, he simply looked at her, really looked at her, not dismissing or assessing, but actually seeing her as a person. "I owe you an apology," he began, his voice low and steady. "Not a diplomatic apology, not the kind where I acknowledge that perhaps I made some minor errors in judgment. A real apology for the prejudice and dismissal I showed you from the moment you arrived at this base." Mitchell remained silent, waiting. "I heard your name, Commander Sarah Mitchell. I made immediate assumptions," Hancock continued. He stood and walked to the window, his silhouette dark against the bright Nevada sunlight. "I assumed that your being assigned here was some kind of political correctness mandate from the Pentagon. I assumed that your presence was a disruption to an established system that was working well. And I assumed, without any evidence whatsoever, that you were less capable than the male pilots I'd worked with for decades." He turned back to face her. "Those assumptions were not based on anything you'd done. They were based entirely on prejudice, not the ugly, obvious kind, but the subtle kind that hides behind tradition and institutional inertia. The kind that tells itself it's not prejudice, it's just the way things are done. And I let that prejudice color every interaction we had." Mitchell's expression remained steady, but something in Hancock's honesty was hitting her harder than anger would have. "What you did in that storm," Hancock said, his voice thick with emotion, "was the most extraordinary display of tactical flying I've witnessed in 40 years of service. And more than that, it was immediate. You didn't hesitate. You didn't ask for permission or reassurance. You recognized that people needed help and you provided it, consequences be damned." He returned to his desk but didn't sit. Instead, he stood before her, and Mitchell recognized the posture. It was the stance of a man stripped of his authority temporarily, standing as an equal rather than a superior. "I want you to understand something, Commander. I was wrong, not in a small way, in a fundamental way about who you are and what you bring to this base. And I was wrong in a way that caused you real harm through the dismissal and coldness you experienced." Mitchell took a breath. When she spoke, her voice was measured but not cold. "Admiral, I appreciate the apology. I do. But I need you to understand something as well. What you did wasn't unusual. It's the standard experience for women in military aviation. We're constantly proving ourselves. We're constantly being tested against unstated criteria that seem to shift based on who's doing the judging." Hancock flinched at that, but he didn't interrupt. "I didn't come here expecting you to welcome me," Mitchell continued. "I came here to do my job, and I knew that doing it well would eventually speak for itself. The flying yesterday wasn't exceptional because I'm a woman. It was exceptional because I'm good at what I do, and I don't need your apology to validate that." There was steel in her voice now, and Hancock heard it. "But," Mitchell said, and her tone softened slightly, "I do appreciate that you're willing to examine your own biases. That takes courage. Most people aren't willing to do that. Most people would find a way to rationalize their assumptions, to convince themselves they were never prejudiced in the first place. You're not doing that. You're looking directly at what you did and you're owning it." Hancock nodded slowly. "What do you need from me, Commander?" Mitchell considered the question carefully. "I need you to use your position to change the culture here. Not just toward me, but toward any woman who comes through that gate. I need you to make sure that female pilots are evaluated on the same criteria as male pilots, their capabilities, their skills, their performance. not on whether they fit someone's idea of what a traditional pilot should look like. That's already happening, Hancock said. I've spoken with command about establishing formal protocols for equal evaluation across all gender lines. I've also initiated a review of any operational decisions I may have made that were influenced by bias. That's a start, Mitchell said. Hancock walked around his desk and leaned against the front of it, a gesture that was deliberately informal, diminishing the distance and the hierarchy between them. I want to know who Viper is, he said quietly. Not the legend, the person, the woman who flew into that storm. Mitchell was quiet for a moment. Then, she's someone who had to be twice as good to get half the respect. Someone who learned that excellence was the only currency that mattered, because everything else could be taken away or discounted. Someone who knows that one mistake could erase years of accomplishments, while men get multiple chances to prove themselves. Viper is someone who decided that despite all of that, she was going to do her job at the highest possible level. And now, Hancock asked, now I'm someone who's starting to believe that maybe the world is changing. Maybe there are people in positions of power who are willing to actually change, not just give lip service to it. Hancock smiled, and it was a sad smile, full of regret and determination. You're right to be skeptical, but I meant what I said. I'm going to do better, and I'm going to hold myself accountable for it. Mitchell stood. I appreciate that, Admiral. I really do. But the apology was for you, not for me. You needed to say it to yourself as much as to me. That's fair, Hancock acknowledged. As Mitchell turned to leave, Hancock called after her. Commander, what you did in that storm, that wasn't just flying. That was courage combined with skill. That was someone who refused to let other people's limitations become her limitations. That's what I should have seen from the beginning. Mitchell paused at the door. She didn't turn around, but her voice came back clear and certain. With all due respect, sir, you weren't looking. Now you are. That's what matters. When she left the office, Hancock stood alone in the afternoon sunlight, a man confronting the reality of his own capacity for prejudice and making a genuine commitment to do better. It wasn't redemption. It wasn't absolution, but it was a beginning. And sometimes that was enough. 3 weeks after the apology in Hancock's office, the base had transformed in ways both obvious and subtle. Mitchell was now in a joint operations planning role, working directly with Patterson and his SEAL team on complex tactical operations that extended far beyond the initial training exercise. The Coordination Center had become the hub where Air Force pilots and special operations teams came together, not in isolation or skepticism, but in genuine collaboration. The first evidence of real change came during a planning session for Operation Desert Arrow, a complex insertion and extraction scenario involving a 10-mile tactical movement through difficult terrain. Patterson, Mitchell, and 4 other senior operators were gathered around a table scattered with topographic maps, satellite imagery, and wind pattern data. The primary insertion point is here, Patterson said, pointing to a valley system. But the wind shear coming down from the ridgeline is going to be brutal for helicopter operations. We'd be vulnerable during descent. Mitchell had been studying the terrain data all morning. What if you insert here instead? She pointed to a location approximately 2 kilometers south. The valley narrows at this point, which creates a wind tunnel effect that's actually more predictable. We can vector the birds in at a steeper angle and minimize time on the ground during vulnerability window. Patterson studied the map, his jaw tightening as he calculated vectors and timing. After a moment, he nodded. That works. That actually works better. We'd have better egress routes if we needed them. And your team's thermal signature would be more dispersed across this ridgeline system, Mitchell continued, already thinking 3 steps ahead. Which means if there's any passive surveillance in the area, they'll have a harder time tracking cohesive movement patterns. One of the older SEALs, Richardson, the man who'd congratulated her after the storm, leaned back in his chair. See, this is why we need her in these meetings. She thinks like a combat pilot, but she understands ground operations. That's because I've spent time on the ground, Mitchell said. Not as much as you have, but enough to understand the constraints you're working with. These kinds of exchanges became routine over the following weeks. Mitchell wasn't just providing air support anymore. She was helping design operations with insights that came from her unique perspective as someone who'd spent thousands of hours looking at tactical problems from 15,000 feet. Her contributions made operations safer and more efficient. But more importantly, her presence was changing something fundamental about the culture of the base. 2 weeks into Mitchell's new operational role, 3 new female pilots arrived for permanent duty assignments. They were young, all in their late 20s, all with solid combat records, all carrying the weight of knowing they'd be tested harder than their male counterparts. The first one, Captain Jennifer Hex Morrison, checked in at the pilot-ready room and immediately felt the difference. The pilots who'd been cold to Mitchell were now welcoming, not patronizing or false, but genuinely interested in getting to know the new arrivals. Morrison found herself being invited to briefings, included in tactical discussions, asked for her opinions on flight procedures. By the end of her first week, she was already feeling like part of the unit rather than an intruder. One afternoon, Morrison found Mitchell in the coordination center and pulled her aside. "I wanted to say thank you," Morrison said quietly. "I know it wasn't easy for you when you got here. The other female pilots who have been through other bases told me how it usually goes. But here it's different." "Hancock made a commitment to change the culture," Mitchell said, "and he followed through. He didn't just issue orders, he modeled the behavior he wanted to see. He started including female pilots in planning sessions. He challenged any comment that showed bias. He made it clear that excellence was the only standard that mattered." "That's not common," Morrison observed. "No, it's not," Mitchell agreed. "But it proves that change is possible, that an entire institution can shift when leadership decides it's important enough to make it happen." Hancock himself had become Mitchell's strongest advocate. In meetings with higher command, he spoke openly about the tactical contributions Mitchell brought to operations. He highlighted the increased operational success rates when female pilots were included in planning processes. He provided data showing that diverse teams made better decisions and had higher success rates in complex operations. Most importantly, he held other officers accountable when they displayed bias, not with punishment but with education, the same way Patterson had been educated when confronted with the reality of who Mitchell actually was. By week 6, the base had 2 other female pilots arriving, including a captain with extensive combat experience who'd flown Wild Weasel operations in the Middle East. The culture shift wasn't just happening, it was accelerating. Female pilots were no longer an anomaly. They were part of the team, integrated naturally into the operational structure. Mitchell found herself mentoring the newer arrivals, not in any formal capacity, but simply by being available when they had questions, when they faced skepticism, when they needed someone who understood what they were dealing with. She shared tactics for navigating institutional resistance, for proving themselves without being aggressive about it, for maintaining professional standards while also asserting their right to be there. One evening, Hex Morrison sat across from Mitchell in the officers' club, nursing a beer. "Can I ask you something personal?" Morrison said. "Sure." "When you got here, when people were treating you like that, didn't you want to quit? Didn't you think about just leaving and going somewhere else?" Mitchell considered the question carefully. "Every day for the first 2 weeks, I won't lie, it was hard, and I considered my options. But I also understood that if I left, the next woman would just go through the same thing, and the one after her. And if I stayed, if I proved myself, then I could help change things not just for me but for everyone coming after me." "That's a lot of pressure to put on yourself," Morrison observed. "It is," Mitchell acknowledged. But it's also an opportunity, and sometimes if you're willing to carry that weight, you can move mountains. Over the following weeks, Mitchell transitioned from being the anomaly into being the standard. She was now one of the senior tactical coordinators, her opinion sought in pre-operation briefings, her insights valued by both Air Force pilots and SEAL teams. She'd been promoted to senior advisor for joint operations, a new position created specifically to formalize the kind of work she was already doing. The transformation wasn't just professional, it was personal. Mitchell finally felt like she belonged, not because she'd proven herself through exceptional flying or combat achievements, though she had. She belonged because the institution had finally decided that her presence mattered, that her contributions were valuable, that diversity in experience and perspective made operations better. Hancock stopped by the coordination center one afternoon, catching Mitchell between operational briefings. "I wanted you to know that retention rates for female pilots have increased by 40% across the base," he said. "Women are actually choosing to stay here. They're requesting transfers to this assignment. That's because of what you've created." "We created it," Mitchell corrected. "You set the tone from the top. I just contributed to the actual operations." "No," Hancock said firmly. "You did more than that. You showed everyone that women belong in combat operations. You showed them that gender doesn't determine capability. You changed this institution, Commander, and I'm grateful." As Hancock walked away, Mitchell stood at her station, looking out at the flight line where both male and female pilots were conducting pre-flight checks, where diversity wasn't a policy but a reality. The battle to prove herself was over. The real work, building something better, was just beginning. 8 years later, Brigadier General Sarah Mitchell stood in dress whites before an auditorium filled with officers, enlisted personnel, and civilian dignitaries. The occasion was Admiral Raymond Hancock's retirement ceremony, 42 years of service to the Navy, and now his final day in uniform. Mitchell had been selected to deliver one of the primary eulogies, a choice that carried weight and significance that only those present understood fully. The transformation from that first day when Hancock had dismissed her from his office to this moment had been gradual, then accelerating, then comprehensive. Mitchell had been promoted through the ranks based on merit and exceptional performance. She'd eventually assumed command of the base's Integrated Air Operations Division. She'd served on strategic planning committees at the Pentagon. She'd become one of the most respected tactical minds in the U.S. military, not because of her gender, but because of her capabilities, her integrity, and her unwavering commitment to excellence. But none of that would have been possible without Hancock's willingness to change. As she approached the podium, Mitchell took a moment to observe the room. There were female pilots in dress uniforms scattered throughout the audience, some of them among the finest aviators in the military now. There were SEALs who trained under Patterson, who'd benefited from the new collaborative operational protocols that Mitchell and Patterson had developed together. There were young officers of all genders, sitting in an institution that had fundamentally shifted its understanding of merit and capability. "Admiral Hancock," Mitchell began, her voice carrying through the auditorium without difficulty. "I've been asked to speak today not about your 42 years of service, though that record speaks eloquently for itself, but about the last 8 years, about the man you became when you were challenged to see beyond your own assumptions and limitations." She paused, letting her gaze sweep across the audience. 8 years ago, I arrived at Naval Air Station Fallon as a temporary duty assignment. I was greeted with dismissal and coldness, not because of anything I'd done, but because of who I was perceived to be. An admiral at the height of his authority looked at me and saw not a fellow officer, not a pilot with 2,000 hours of combat experience, but a complication, a deviation from how things had always been done. Mitchell could see Hancock in the front row, his jaw tight, his eyes never wavering from hers. "That dismissal would have been routine," Mitchell continued. It would have been one more experience among dozens of similar moments in my career, forgotten by everyone except me. But something extraordinary happened. An admiral, a man accustomed to absolute authority and respect, looked at what I had done in a moment of crisis, and he chose to examine his own biases. He chose to acknowledge that his assumptions had been wrong, and most importantly, he chose to change. She shifted her weight slightly, her hands gripping the sides of the podium. Changing is hard. Admitting that you were wrong is hard. Holding yourself accountable when you have the power to avoid accountability is almost impossibly hard. Admiral Hancock did all of those things, and in doing so, he didn't just change one interaction. He changed the culture of an entire military institution. Mitchell pulled up a slide showing statistics. Female pilot retention had increased by 70% over 8 years. Female officers in operational commands had tripled. The base had become one of the most diverse and high-performing commands in the entire military, and operational success rates across all tactical operations had improved significantly. "These numbers aren't just statistics," Mitchell said. "They represent lives. They represent women who decided to stay in military service because they knew they would be evaluated fairly. They represent young officers who learned that capability matters more than tradition. They represent an institution that became stronger because it learned to value diverse perspectives and experiences." She paused, her expression becoming more personal. "Admiral Hancock taught me something that I've carried with me throughout the rest of my career. He taught me that true leadership isn't about being infallible. It's about being willing to see the truth, even when that truth challenges everything you believed. It's about having the courage to admit mistakes and the commitment to do better. And it's about understanding that when you hold a position of power, your choices ripple out and affect everyone beneath you." Mitchell's voice became quieter, more intense. "I've had people ask me over the years why I didn't hold a grudge against Admiral Hancock, why I didn't use his initial rejection as an excuse for bitterness or resentment. The answer is simple: because he changed. Not in words, but in actions. Not in public performance, but in daily decisions that reflected his commitment to creating a more inclusive institution." She looked directly at Hancock now. "You taught me what real apology looks like. You taught me that respect, once earned, can transform relationships. And you taught me that an institution is only as good as its leadership's willingness to challenge its own biases." The applause that followed was sustained and genuine, people standing, offering not just ceremonial recognition but authentic acknowledgement of what Hancock had accomplished by becoming the leader the institution needed him to be. When the ceremony concluded, there was a reception in the officers' club. Mitchell found herself in conversation with Patterson, who'd retired from active duty 2 years prior, but remained heavily involved in mentoring younger SEAL teams. "Hell of a speech," Patterson said, shaking her hand. "You didn't mention that he almost got you killed by ordering you to stay out of operations." "He didn't order it," Mitchell corrected gently. "He just made clear that I wasn't welcome. The difference matters." "Does it?" Patterson asked. "Yeah," Mitchell said thoughtfully. "Because one is authority enforcing itself, and the other is subtle resistance that people have to navigate. One can be directly confronted, and the other requires patience and excellence to overcome. I needed to overcome the second kind." Later that evening, after most of the guests had left, Hancock found Mitchell alone on the terrace overlooking the flight line. The desert sunset was painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, and in the distance, an F-22 was conducting a final training flight before nightfall. "Thank you for what you said today," Hancock began. "I meant every word," Mitchell replied. They stood in silence for a moment, two officers whose relationship had transformed from antagonism to genuine respect. "I've thought about our first meeting thousands of times," Hancock said quietly. "About how I treated you, how close I came to missing out on knowing someone exceptional. And I realized something. I almost destroyed a career because I couldn't see past my own biases." "You didn't," Mitchell said, "because when confronted with the truth, you changed. That matters more than the initial mistake." "Does it?" Hancock asked, echoing Patterson's question from earlier. "Do you really believe that?" Mitchell turned to face him directly. "I believe that people are defined not by their worst moments but by what they do when they're confronted with those moments. You had a choice, Admiral. You could have rationalized your dismissal of me. You could have told yourself that I was overreacting, that you were just maintaining standards, that there was nothing wrong with your behavior. But you didn't. You looked at the truth and you changed. That's leadership." Hancock's eyes were wet when she finished speaking. "I hope," he said slowly, "that whoever comes after me understands what we built here. Understands that the strongest institution is one that's willing to question itself, to challenge its own assumptions, and to include voices that might be different from what came before." "They will," Mitchell said with certainty. "Because you made sure of it, because you held yourself accountable, and because there are now dozens of officers, male and female, who learned from your example." As Hancock walked back into the reception, Mitchell remained on the terrace, watching the F-22 complete its landing approach. She thought about that first day, when she'd walked into his office uncertain of her place in the world. She thought about the storm, the moment when everything changed. She thought about the long journey from being dismissed to being celebrated. And she understood finally that the most powerful victory wasn't proving she belonged. It was creating a world where the next person wouldn't have to prove it at all. The legacy wasn't just hers. It was theirs, a legacy of growth, change, and the understanding that true strength comes from the willingness to evolve.